In this episode, we tackle one of the most uncomfortable realities in cybersecurity. You can be right about a risk and still fail to make progress because people resist the change you are asking for. Resistance shows up in obvious ways, like direct disagreement, but it also shows up in subtle ways, like delays, endless questions, quiet workarounds, and polite nods followed by no action. For beginners, resistance can feel personal, as if the other person is rejecting you or disrespecting security, but most resistance is not about you at all. It is usually about cost, uncertainty, fear of disruption, loss of control, or fatigue from too many competing demands. The challenge is that security also has real boundaries that cannot be negotiated away because certain standards exist to prevent serious harm. So the skill is not choosing between empathy and firmness, but combining them, understanding why someone is pushing back while still protecting the outcomes that must be protected. When you can do that, you stop treating resistance as an enemy and start treating it as information you can work with. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Empathy in this context means taking the other person's concerns seriously enough to understand them clearly, even if you ultimately cannot agree with their conclusion. A common misconception is that empathy requires giving people what they want, but empathy is really about accurate perspective taking. If someone resists a new control, they may be worried it will slow down their work, confuse their team, or create more support tickets, and those concerns might be valid even if the control is still necessary. When you acknowledge those concerns in plain language, you reduce defensiveness and increase the chance of a constructive conversation. People rarely feel persuaded by someone who seems indifferent to the pain they are experiencing. Empathy also signals respect, and respect is the currency that allows hard standards to be enforced without creating lasting resentment. For brand new learners, a simple rule is that you do not have to agree with the objection, but you do have to show that you heard it correctly. The moment a person feels heard, their brain becomes more open to hearing you. At the same time, defending non-negotiable standards requires clarity about what is truly non-negotiable and why. If everything is labeled non-negotiable, the label loses meaning, and people assume security is using power rather than reason. If nothing is labeled non-negotiable, standards erode through 1,000 small exceptions until controls exist mostly on paper. The healthy approach is to identify the few core requirements that protect the most critical outcomes, such as preventing unauthorized access to sensitive systems, protecting sensitive data, or preserving the ability to detect and respond to incidents. Non-negotiable standards should be tied to clear harm prevention, not to preference or tradition, because people accept firmness more readily when they see the consequence. This is where measurable outcomes help, because you can explain that the standard exists to reduce a specific risk rather than to satisfy security's comfort. Clarity also protects you, because it prevents you from being pulled into ad hoc negotiations that change based on who is asking. When you know what must not change, you can be flexible everywhere else. Most resistance can be categorized into a few patterns, and recognizing the pattern helps you respond without getting emotionally pulled into the conflict. One pattern is capability resistance, where the person believes they cannot comply because they lack tools, time, training, or staffing. Another pattern is value resistance, where they do not believe the risk is real or they believe the control is not worth the cost. A third pattern is autonomy resistance, where they resent being told what to do or fear that security will take over their process. A fourth pattern is history resistance, where past security initiatives were painful or poorly managed, so people assume this one will be too. These patterns are not diagnoses. They are lenses that help you choose the right response. If the resistance is about capability, your path is enablement and support, not argument. If the resistance is about value, your path is clearer risk framing and evidence, not pressure. If the resistance is about autonomy, your path is collaboration on implementation details while holding the standard constant. When you respond empathetically, the goal is to surface the real objection, because people often start with a surface-level complaint that hides a deeper concern. Someone might say the policy is annoying when the real fear is that their team will miss a deadline and be blamed. Someone might say security is overreacting when the real concern is that previous incidents were mismanaged and they do not trust the process. Your job is to ask calm questions that invite specificity, such as what part will be hardest for your team or what failure are you most worried about if we do this. These questions are powerful because they turn vague resistance into concrete constraints you can address. They also signal that you are not trying to win an argument. You are trying to solve a problem. As the objection becomes clearer, you can separate what is negotiable from what is not. That separation is the heart of the skill. You empathize with the constraint, then you protect the standard, then you collaborate on the path. Defending non-negotiables is much easier when you can explain the standard in plain language and link it to a real scenario that the listener can imagine. You do not need to be dramatic. You just need to be concrete. For example, if the standard is that privileged access must be tightly controlled, you can explain that when a privileged account is misused, it can change systems, disable protections, and spread harm quickly, which is why the organization must make that access harder to abuse. This is not a threat, it is a causal chain. People resist less when they understand the mechanism of harm, because the request feels rational rather than arbitrary. It also helps to explain what the standard is not trying to do, such as saying the goal is not to slow down work, but to prevent a specific failure mode. That clarification reduces the tendency to interpret security as hostile. The more you can make the standard feel like a shared protection instead of a security preference, the more defensible it becomes. A practical technique is to negotiate the how while holding the what steady, because many conflicts arise when people think security is dictating both the outcome and the entire workflow. The what is the non-negotiable outcome, such as ensuring sensitive data is protected or ensuring high-risk access is strongly controlled. The how is the implementation path, such as which team owns which steps, what timeline is realistic, and what support is needed. When you invite collaboration on the how, you give people agency, and agency reduces resistance. At the same time, you must be clear that agency is about choosing the path, not about choosing whether the standard applies. This distinction should be communicated calmly, without apology, because apologizing for a standard suggests it is optional or unreasonable. You can be empathetic while still being firm by saying you understand the burden and you are willing to adjust the rollout plan, but the protective outcome must be achieved. People often accept firmness when it is paired with genuine help. It is also important to recognize that some resistance is actually useful because it can reveal flaws in the plan that security did not see. For example, a control might create an operational bottleneck that increases the chance of unsafe workarounds, which is the opposite of what you want. An empathetic approach listens for these signals and treats them as design input rather than as annoyance. That does not mean you drop the standard. It means you improve the way the standard is achieved. In security, controls that are impossible to follow are not strong controls. They are paper controls that create a false sense of safety. If resistance reveals that a requirement is unclear, too complex, or mismatched to reality, you should adjust the guidance, clarify expectations, or provide better enablement. Doing this openly also increases trust, because it shows that security can learn and adapt without abandoning principles. Over time, this turns resistance conversations into collaboration rather than conflict. When you must say no, the way you say it matters, because tone shapes whether the other person leaves feeling respected or dismissed. A firm no can be paired with explanation and alternatives, such as stating the non-negotiable requirement, briefly explaining the risk it prevents, and offering a path that reduces burden while still meeting the requirement. This is where follow-through becomes critical, because offering alternatives that never materialize is a fast way to lose trust. If you promise support, you must deliver it, whether that means providing clearer documentation, helping coordinate across teams, or ensuring leadership understands the resource impact. Another key part is consistency, because if you make exceptions for one team without clear reasoning, other teams will feel punished for compliance. If an exception truly must occur, it should be handled as an exception with explicit boundaries and oversight, not as a quiet bypass. That protects the standard while acknowledging reality. There will also be moments when resistance is not about constraints, but about avoidance, and you need to recognize that case without becoming cynical. Avoidance resistance often shows up as endless delay, constant requests for more justification, or shifting objections that never resolve. In those moments, empathy still matters, but the response may need to include stronger accountability, such as clear deadlines, escalation paths, and defined consequences. Defending non-negotiables sometimes means involving leadership, not to punish, but to clarify priorities and align expectations across the organization. This is where executive sponsorship is valuable, because a sponsor can reinforce that the standard is required and that the organization will allocate resources accordingly. The facilitator mindset helps here too, because you can frame the issue as a decision. Either we meet the standard by a certain date using a realistic plan, or we accept and document the risk with explicit ownership. Avoidance loses power when the choice is made visible. As you develop this skill, the big takeaway is that empathy and firmness are not opposites. They are complementary tools that help you protect the organization without damaging relationships. Empathy helps you understand the real source of resistance, design workable paths, and communicate in a way that keeps people engaged. Defending non-negotiables protects the outcomes that prevent serious harm and keeps the organization from drifting into unsafe compromises. When you combine them, you build a reputation for being both reasonable and reliable, someone who listens deeply and still holds the line when it matters. For brand new learners, that is especially important because it shows you can contribute to security leadership even before you have deep technical authority. The organization does not only need experts, it needs people who can move humans towards safer behavior without creating resentment or chaos. If you practice this consistently, resistance becomes less of a wall and more of a doorway into better, stronger, more sustainable security.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.